A few years ago, I was sitting in a coffee shop near my flat in East London, just scrolling through the news on my phone, half awake, waiting for the espresso to kick in. And there it was, top of the feed. Dollar hits 2-0, year high despite record US debt. I remember putting the phone face down and sitting with that for a moment, because think about what that sentence actually says. The United States owes more money than any country in the history of civilization. It runs the largest trade deficit on Earth. Its infrastructure is crumbling. Its political system is publicly, chaotically broken. So why does everyone still want the dollar? I kept coming back to that, not obsessively the way you return to something you can't quite resolve. And eventually, months later, digging through declassified documents in the British Library, I found the answer. It's not a complicated answer, but it's one almost nobody explains clearly. The dollar doesn't survive because of American economic discipline. It doesn't survive because of military power, not directly. It survives because of a deal made in a desert in 1974 that the US Treasury kept secret for over 40 years. And once you understand what that deal actually was, you will look at a price tag, a news headline, a petrol pump, differently for the rest of your life. To understand it, you have to go back 3 years earlier, to a moment when the dollar genuinely should have collapsed. The 15th of August, 1971. Richard Nixon sits in front of a television camera and cancels a promise that had held the global economy together for a quarter century. He announced that the United States was ending the convertibility of dollars into gold. Since 1944, since Bretton Woods, every dollar carried a guarantee. Bring $35 to the US government. They hand you 1 ounce of gold. Simple, physical, real. Nixon canceled it. He had no choice. Through the 1960s, the US had been spending enormously. Vietnam, the Great Society welfare programs, the space race. Foreign governments had started doing the math. They'd been quietly converting their dollar reserves into gold, draining American vaults month by month. Nixon had a choice: reform American spending or break the gold promise. He broke the promise. Economists called it the Nixon shock, which understates it considerably. Because what he'd done was cut the dollar loose from the one thing that gave it universal, irrefutable value. The obvious question immediately followed. If the dollar isn't backed by gold anymore, what on earth is it backed by? For a couple of years, nobody had a clean answer. Then the Middle East provided one accidentally, through a crisis that was supposed to destroy America, not save its currency. In October 1973, OPEC declared an oil embargo against the United States and its allies. The trigger was the Yom Kippur War, the punishment for Western support of Israel. What happened next was swift and merciless. Oil prices quadrupled within months. I think about this sometimes when I'm filling up near Heathrow, watching the numbers tick over on the pump. Even at today's prices, the 1,973 shock was in a different category entirely. Factories shutting down mid-shift, petrol queues stretching around city blocks, airlines canceling routes, the entire industrial machinery of Western civilization grinding toward a halt. The US economy was staring into a genuine abyss, and the dollar, now detached from gold, had never looked more exposed. Enter Henry Kissinger, Nixon's Secretary of State, a man who approached every crisis with the same question: who has leverage here, and how do we get it? Kissinger looked at the situation and saw something most people were missing. The oil embargo hadn't just created an American problem. It had created something else. Arab oil-producing states sitting on an almost incomprehensible pile of new wealth, almost overnight. Saudi Arabia was in an extraordinary position. The world's largest proven oil reserves, suddenly enormously rich, but also surrounded by hostile powers, ruled by a royal family whose grip was not guaranteed, sitting in one of the most unstable regions on Earth. The Saudis needed what the US had: military protection, advanced weapons, a credible promise the Americans would be there when things went wrong. The Americans needed what the Saudis had: a way to tie the dollar to something the entire world would always, structurally, need. The details of what followed took decades to surface. I first worked through the declassified files at the British Library, pulled sideways from a paper I was supposedly writing about interwar monetary policy. The documents are aggressively boring. Meeting minutes, diplomatic cables, officials describing enormous things in carefully dull language. In June 1974, U.S. Treasury Secretary William Simon flew to Riyadh. What was negotiated over the following months would stay classified for over 4 decades. The structure that emerged: Saudi Arabia would price its oil exclusively in US dollars. OPEC would follow. The enormous dollar surpluses Saudi Arabia accumulated petrodollars would be recycled into US Treasury bonds, loaned, essentially, back to America. In exchange, military protection, advanced weapons, a guarantee of the Saudi state's survival. Now pause. Because this is worth actually sitting with. Before 1971, the dollar had value because you could exchange it for gold, finite, physical, universally accepted. After 1974, the dollar had value because you needed it to buy oil. And oil is not a niche commodity. Oil runs factories, heats homes, moves cargo ships, powers planes. Oil is the base layer of industrial civilization. If you're Germany or Japan or South Korea or Brazil, any country that needs energy to function, you need to hold dollars. You need to earn dollars. You need to maintain dollar reserves. You need to stay inside the dollar system. Suddenly, the entire world had a structural, inescapable, daily reason to want American currency. That is the petrodollar. That is what people mean by the oil standard. Pause. It replaced gold, not through democratic consent or transparent policy, but through the quiet mechanics of necessity. And what it created for the United States was something unprecedented in monetary history. It could run deficits that would destroy any other country's currency, and the world would simply absorb them. I notice this sometimes at the Waitrose near my flat, watching the price tags. A significant portion of British inflation, European inflation, emerging market inflation, it originates in American fiscal decisions made thousands of miles away. When the United States spends beyond its means, it doesn't just devalue its own currency. It exports that devaluation across every economy that holds dollars, which is essentially all of them. Other countries don't get this. Argentina runs deficits. Investors flee the peso overnight. Turkey prints money. The lira collapses in weeks. But the US has run persistent trade deficits for 50 years, accumulated debt exceeding its GDP, and the dollar keeps holding. Not because of discipline, because of infrastructure. Infrastructure built in 1974, and quietly maintained ever since. I want to be precise here, because this kind of story attracts a lot of noise. This is not a conspiracy. There is no secret room where a handful of people run the world. What it is, and this is genuinely more interesting, is structural power. Pragmatic decisions made by exhausted officials in the middle of a crisis, which created a system that outlasted all of them and now shapes the lives of 8 billion people. Nixon is dead. Kissinger is dead. The specific terms of those 1,974 agreements have been revised many times since. But the structure they built, oil denominated in dollars, petrodollar recycling through US Treasury markets, the dollar as global reserve currency, that structure is still standing. One number I keep returning to: around 80% of global oil transactions are still denominated in US dollars. A country with 4% of the world's population, running a currency that underpins the majority of global energy trade. That is not a natural market outcome. It is the result of a specific deal, made at a specific moment. maintained through consistent economic and political pressure. On that last point, I'll give you the facts and let you draw your own conclusions. Muammar Gaddafi spent years building toward a Pan-African gold-backed currency to replace the dollar in African oil trade. He was deposed and killed in 2011. Saddam Hussein switched Iraq's oil sales from dollars to euros in 2000. The US invaded in 2003. Iran has consistently tried to price its oil in non-dollar currencies. Iran has been under severe sanctions for decades. I'm not claiming direct causality in every case. History is always more complicated than one cause. But if you understand what the petrodollar means structurally, the enormous privilege it creates, and what serious alternatives would threaten these patterns, stop looking random. Things are shifting now. China has been building the infrastructure for a petro-yuan for years. After 2022 sanctions, Russia started demanding rubles for gas exports. The BRICS nations have openly discussed a dollar alternative. These are real developments. But the dollar system has one advantage: its competitors haven't replicated. Not military power, not economic virtue. Trust: cold, functional, institutional trust, built from 80 years of being the default option that everyone else also uses. Switching the global financial system away from dollars would be like changing the working language of the internet. Even if you find it arbitrary, the switching cost is almost impossibly high. So the answer to the question in that coffee shop turns out to be straightforward, once you know where to look. The dollar survives because energy survival depends on it. Because in 1974, someone tied the world's entire industrial infrastructure to American currency, and the rest of the world has been reinforcing that structure every single day since. You weren't supposed to understand how this worked, not because it's purely sinister, but because the whole system functions better when most people assume the dollar is just naturally valuable, inevitably dominant. Now you know it isn't. It's infrastructure, built in a desert, hidden for 40 years, and still running. If this changed how you see things, subscribe. I make these videos because I keep finding questions underneath the obvious ones, and economic history is full of them. Next one looks at what happens when this structure starts to crack, because the early signs are already there, and the implications are significant. Drop a comment with anything you'd push back on. I read them all. And if you know someone who's ever asked why the dollar survives everything, this is the answer they've been looking for.